whispers began long before the rising sun, faint and insidious, carried on the cold breath of the pre-dawn air. Our scouts returned to the encampment, looking less like seasoned warriors and more like pale wraiths, their faces etched with a terror that went beyond battle dust or enemy weaponry. They spoke in hushed, breathless tones of something profoundly unsettling, something defying the logic of warfare itself. What they reported was not an attack from without, but rather a strange, devastating affliction emanating from within the ranks. It started subtly enough, stumbling footsteps and muttered Latin prayers echoing through the deserted outer defenses. Groups of exhausted men, ostensibly Crusaders, were advancing silently, moving with a terrible, detached grace. They didn't regard the abandoned tents or the non-combatant personnel in the periphery as human beings. They treated them like objects in a bizarre, nightmarish play. They moved as if possessed by an unfamiliar, singular directive. As the pale fingers of morning struggled to breach the horizon, their disturbing actions only intensified. The scouts described men acting with a primal ferocity, attacking abandoned goods and people who had fallen into sleep or were simply too exhausted to defend themselves. There was no malice visible in their movements, merely an uncanny, mechanical obedience. It was as if these hardened soldiers had slipped into some profound delirium, divorced from the reality of their surroundings, reduced to feral beasts, executing ancient, desperate rites under the cloak of deep sleep. The mere presence of this uncontrolled behavior cast a pall over the entire camp. The usual rigorous military discipline was replaced by confusion and dread. The command structure, already strained by weeks of relentless campaigning and insufficient rest, found itself facing an enemy far more intangible than any opposing army. Exhaustion, coupled with mass psychological breakdown. This creeping disturbance began to affect the objects and rituals as well. The medic, who was initially skeptical, began tracking patterns of collection around the perimeter, strange idols, unidentifiable bones, scraps of silk, every piece seemingly imbued with religious significance, yet defying rational arrangement. These materials were not being kept for memorial or study. They were carefully arranged into disturbing formations near the palisade, an evidence of ritualistic preparation that held no discernible military value. It was a practice more suited to temple worship than frontier defense. The tension reached a boiling point during a heated confrontation between two senior knights. The accusation leveled was not merely one of cowardice or negligence, but of profound spiritual and psychological compromise. One knight accused the other of abandoning his vows, citing increasingly erratic behavior and an obsessive need for midnight ablutions at hours inappropriate to their sacred commitment. It wasn't just the act itself, but the frequency and irrational timing of these rituals that fueled the volatile dispute. The severity of the crisis culminated in an emergency council convened by the camp commander, lit by flickering torches that cast dancing shadows on anxious faces. The gravity of the situation was made undeniable. A senior priest revealed disturbing, written accounts smuggled from distant posts, testaments detailing entire battalions caught in what could only be described as sleepwalking piety. These were not tales of simple delirium or madness. They were descriptions of mass atrocities committed not out of spiteful malice, but with a chilling, almost biological sense of mechanical duty. The mystery deepened as the day struggled toward full daylight and rest remained stubbornly elusive. The medic watched in disbelief as a large contingent began to subtly detach from the main camp's perimeter. Instead of dispersing or resting, they formed themselves into disciplined waves, moving deliberately toward the nearest civilian village. They carried strange flags, more symbolic than tactical, and shouted hymns that sounded less like prayers invoking divine aid and more like ritualistic declarations intended to challenge some unseen spiritual authority. The situation demanded intervention. Authorities quickly managed to detain a key participant, a younger soldier who appeared to be the nexus point of the growing confusion. In the relative sanctuary of a tent, they attempted to extract coherent information through interrogation. What emerged, however, was far more troubling than simple madness. His answers were a terrifying jumble, fragments of genuine religious dogma mixed seamlessly with frighteningly specific, detailed narratives concerning mass sleepwalking attacks and nocturnal, hypnotic compulsion. As the hours continued to stretch toward dawn, and exhaustion weighed upon every man's soul, the unsettling activity intensified around the central well. An unsanctioned gathering began, a vortex of disturbed energy centered near the camp's primary water source. The afflicted Crusaders started performing synchronized movements, chanting incantations that bordered on gibberish. They treated the well not merely as a mundane necessity for survival, but as an arcane portal or some kind of sacred altar demanding ritual acknowledgement. Moment reached a critical zenith. Recognizing the gathering was nearing its peak intensity, the camp commander issued a direct order: intervention. Knights and guards formed defensive lines, their goal being to physically separate the afflicted men from the central well. This attempt at control immediately triggered a violent resistance. The energy expended in this clash drained every remaining reserve of strength across both sides, transforming the discipline into sheer, aching fatigue. Then the final surrender arrived with the dawn's full brilliance. As the sun finally crested the horizon, those synchronized movements halted with an abrupt, jarring stillness. One by one, the afflicted group collapsed in a heap upon the cold earth. Some fell vomiting from sheer depletion. Others were weeping silently into their hands, and most simply succumbed to a deep, unconscious slumber. The strange array of ritualistic objects remained scattered around them, evidence of an unsustainable vigil. The ensuing silence was absolute, broken only by the distant sounds of the camp, resuming its semblance of life. In this profound quiet, the immediate investigation began in earnest. The medic approached the discarded pattern of items, kneeling down to study their arrangement. He quickly realized that the pattern was anything but random. It formed a clear, undeniable map, a directional guide pointing directly toward an overlooked and dangerously vulnerable weakness within their own defensive lines. This single revelation forced an immediate and drastic pivot in the command structure's strategy for survival, turning the focus from internal turmoil to external threat. The encampment was a place of frayed nerves and dwindling reserves, a pressure cooker of faith strained by endless marching and poor rations. The initial reports of nocturnal wanderings had settled into a deeply troubling routine. By the second morning, the unsettling occurrences seemed to have acquired an eerie predictability. A core group of exhausted pilgrims, forever caught between wakefulness and delirium, continued their strange nightly activities. They moved with the mechanical precision of ghosts, haunted not by earthly fear, but by the deep current of some shared, profound exhaustion that frayed the edges of reality itself. Assigned to monitor this growing psychological disturbance was a young medic, initially viewing the phenomena through the lens of martial fatigue and simple disease. His skepticism, however, began to erode against the tide of strange evidence. The tenuous peace of the encampment was continually undermined by friction, not from external threats, but from within its own zealous ranks. The men who had gathered under banners of devotion and piety were proving to be as volatile as any enemy force they expected to face. Discipline frayed at the edges, exhaustion gnawed relentlessly at their collective sanity. Deeply ingrained vows, promises made before God on holy ground, suddenly seemed meaningless when faced with the creeping psychological strain of relentless campaigning. This tension found its most dramatic outlet in a heated confrontation between two figures of authority, senior knights whose reputations were built upon unwavering adherence to law and sacred oaths. The accusations exchanged that night were not about battle plans or supply routes. They struck at the very core of who these men believed themselves to be. One knight, perhaps representing rigid orthodoxy, faced another whom he accused of profound deviation, a failure not merely of military strategy, but of spiritual discipline itself. The focus quickly narrowed to esoteric habits and sudden compulsions. Specifically, one senior officer became the target of suspicion for his obsessive midnight ablutions, rituals performed at times that defied all established sacred schedules, regardless of whether the camp had observed proper sanitary protocol or if a consecrated facility was even available. This was no mere lateness. It was an unsettling pattern of behavior that suggested a deeper disconnect from routine and self-control. The stakes were impossibly high. To suggest a breach in one's vows was to suggest a spiritual contamination, a corruption that could threaten the entire group's divine purpose for being there. Such claims required undeniable proof, yet all the witnesses offered were shaky accounts filtered through delirium, fatigue, and sheer paranoia. The argument spiraled into accusations of weakness, not just physical frailty, but moral and psychological failure. It became clear that the unraveling was more complex than a simple disagreement over rules or propriety. It suggested a deeper fissure within their shared reality, an area where personal religious belief collided violently with the exhaustion-induced instability of the soul. The core issue transcended mere ceremonial timing. It hinted at a surrender to subconscious impulses, a break from the conscious will that defined them as holy warriors. When man's faith is stripped bare by deprivation and fatigue, what remains is often not devotion, but something stranger, ritualistic compulsion. And that compulsion, it seemed, was beginning to rewrite the laws of their encampment. One strange act at a time, the stench of stale sweat, fear, and unwashed piety hung heavy in the air of the keep. It was an atmosphere thick enough to chew, weighted by unspoken paranoia and the desperate need for answers. The commander's chambers were a place designed for authority, yet now they felt claustrophobic, stifling any truth that dared to surface. By torchlight, shadows danced along the stone walls, amplifying every whisper into a potential threat. The call to gather was not an assembly of council, but a forced convocation, held under duress. Exhaustion had stripped the men bare, leaving only their most visceral anxieties exposed. Seated at rough wooden tables were figures of immense spiritual and military weight: generals, captains, and high-ranking priests whose authority usually commanded silence. Tonight, however, they sat in a state of brittle tension, each man watchful, yet utterly drained. The meeting began with the usual formality of war councils, an attempt to impose order upon palpable chaos. Reports were exchanged regarding skirmishes along the perimeter, skirmishes that seemed more personal than strategic, focused on broken pottery or mysteriously misplaced prayer books. But soon the conversation shifted, drawn by a current far darker and stranger than mere battlefield exhaustion. A senior priest, a man whose face was typically impassive and etched with eternal scripture, spoke. His voice was usually a booming affirmation of faith, but tonight it carried a brittle tremor, as if speaking too loudly might shatter him entirely. He didn't speak of enemy forces or siege tactics. Instead, he began reading from fragmented documents, manuscripts, and scraps of papyrus, that had been smuggled in from outlying posts, texts treated with the reverence usually reserved for relics. These accounts were unlike anything they expected to hear. They spoke not of physical combat, but of a profound loss of self, a descent into collective delirium. The reports described entire units, fully trained battalions, suffering what was termed sleepwalking piety. It painted a picture far more terrifying than any foe. Men acting as if their deepest devotion had overridden the basic functions of human consciousness. The accounts detailed atrocities committed not by malevolent intent, but with a chilling, mechanical obedience. The afflicted would advance silently in coordinated groups, striking and disturbing non-combatants, local villagers, women tending gardens, or even fellow soldiers who had simply fallen asleep nearby. They were depicted as puppets of an internal nightly compulsion, driven by impulses that defied military doctrine and human sanity. Whispers erupted among the gathered officers. Some dismissed it immediately, attributing the reports to fever dreams, exaggeration, or enemy propaganda designed to sow discord. Others remained strangely silent, their faces masks of troubled contemplation, as if these descriptions held a resonance deep within their own exhausted minds. The priest continued, his gaze sweeping over the assembled men, pinning them with an intensity that was almost accusatory. He emphasized that this was not merely simple madness. These were rituals, patterns of behavior that suggested a deeper, shared psychological break, a susceptibility to profound sleep states where piety became pathological. He revealed details about strange object placement near defensive lines, idols smashed and discarded, piles of unidentifiable bones arranged in specific geometries, and the compulsive necessity of performing unscheduled ablutions at midnight. These were not acts of discipline. They were symptoms of a breakdown, rituals meant to manage an internal landscape that was rapidly becoming unbearable. The men heard their own echoes in these descriptions. The senior medic, who had first observed the peculiar object gathering near the palisade, felt a prickle of dread run down his spine. The captains present remembered moments when discipline seemed to fray at the edges, when exhaustion blurred duty with ritualistic preoccupation. The accusations were becoming too close to home, too uncomfortable for the hardened men gathered there. One officer, visibly disturbed, finally stood up. He spoke not as a man of command, but as one profoundly affected by doubt. He questioned the source and reliability of these desperate, fragmented accounts, arguing that such psychological instability could only happen when physical fatigue reached its absolute breaking point. He suggested, perhaps too gently, that focusing on internal delirium was merely ignoring the tangible threat lying just beyond their gates. But the collective mood was already soured by the weight of the accusations. The senior priest countered with chilling eloquence, suggesting that the enemy might not be outside the walls, but within the men's own minds, manifesting during the vulnerable veil between sleep and waking life. He argued that this sleepwalking piety represented a crisis of faith as much as a military threat, a terrifying question about whether their commitment to God was robust enough to withstand the attrition of war. The accuser had placed a spotlight on the uncomfortable truth. In the throes of unending conflict, when rest was a forgotten luxury and spiritual certainty was eroded by gore and fear, the lines separating devoted faith from profound delusion became terrifyingly indistinguishable. The meeting ended not with a definitive resolution or an action plan, but with a corrosive sense of unease, a gnawing understanding that they were all susceptible to these nocturnal nightmares, held captive in their own exhausted minds. The relentless grind of war, coupled with the unnatural strain of continuous vigilance, gnawed at the edges of their sanity. Days bled into nights without true rest, and sleep, when it finally came, was shallow, haunted, and profoundly restless. What began as mere exhaustion curdled into something more sinister, feeding on fear and ritualized desperation. The medic had watched the pattern emerge, a detachment from the coherent military structure, replaced by an invisible current pulling men toward delirium. Now, as the day progressed and true rest remained elusive, that mysterious activity intensified beyond all rational understanding. It was no longer merely strange behavior observed at dawn. It was a systemic failure of the mind, manifesting in coordinated groups. The medic watched, helpless, as a large contingent began to peel away from the main camp perimeter. They moved not in panicked scattering, but in disciplined, unsettling waves, each group maintaining its own unnerving rhythm. Their focus lay entirely outside the protective boundaries of the palisade and toward the nearest civilian village, a beacon of assumed safety for their enemies. Yet strangely, it became the focal point of their shared hallucination. As they marched, the objective was not war in the conventional sense. It was a strange procession marked by symbols and ritual. They carried strange flags, banners that bore no recognized heraldry, fluttering like diseased standards. And from these clusters of sleep-addled figures poured hymns, songs that were profoundly unsettling. They did not sound like formalized prayer intended to appeal to a divine being, nor did they mimic the battle cries of approaching foes. Instead, they sounded less like worship and more like ritualistic challenge, chanting an incomprehensible dogma aimed at some unseen power, or perhaps themselves. The disciplined nature of their movement was perhaps the most terrifying aspect. These were not stragglers. These were men operating under a unified, subconscious mandate. Their strides were synchronized, their purpose singular, bypassing the pleas and warnings of the remaining guards. Those who tried to stop them found resistance that was strangely pliable. They would stumble, they would moan, but they refused to break rhythm, refusing to acknowledge boundaries, or even the immediate danger posed by the command structure. The central difficulty became distinguishing between mere psychological breakdown and genuine, albeit pathological, collective delusion. Was this a profound fever sickness exacerbated by starvation, or something deeper, something feeding on the desperate need for meaning in the face of overwhelming terror? As they drew nearer to the village, their behavior grew more intensely focused on specific architectural elements, particular wells, distinct crossroads, and small gathering places that seemed imbued with an impossible significance. The medic noted how these figures treated non-combatants not as people needing protection, but as props in a macabre theatrical performance. Their gestures were precise. The arrangement of objects they encountered was deliberate, confirming earlier suspicions about their ritualistic compulsion to collect and arrange. This collective fever dream was rapidly metastasizing, demanding more and more focus, draining the resources, both spiritual and physical, from the entire camp. The military strategy crumbled in comparison to this terrifying internal enemy. Commanders were paralyzed between confronting a hostile village or addressing an affliction within their own ranks that defied all established protocol of war. Every guard shift became tense with suppressed anxiety. Every meal was eaten in whispers, as if loud noise might provoke another wave of the inexplicable behavior. The cumulative effect of these nocturnal episodes, these semi-lucid wanderings through the dead hours, had reached a critical mass. It transcended military disorder and entered the realm of collective psycho-spiritual breakdown. This deep delirium suggested that the pressure cooker of sustained warfare was not merely testing their endurance. It was fundamentally rewriting their perceived reality, stripping away the difference between God's will and man's raw, unfettered terror. The physical exhaustion only served to deepen this delusion, lubricating the edges of reason, until they could no longer tell which commands originated from faith, duty, or the inescapable currents of sleep-deprived mania. This mounting pressure foreshadowed a climax, a point where the collective internal crisis would finally erupt into visible, undeniable action, regardless of the physical consequences. The stage was set for a reckoning with their own minds. The user wants me to write a very long, continuous, cinematic historical documentary narration script for Chapter 6, The Interrogation of the Dreamer. The chapter context involves capturing a young, central figure among the sleepwalking Crusaders and interrogating him. His answers are described as being an incomprehensible mix of dogma and specific dream descriptions about mass attacks. This must follow the escalating tension built over previous chapters: ritualistic behavior, separation from camp, profound psychological breakdown. I must adhere to all strict formatting rules, plain prose, no forbidden elements, and maintain a dark, immersive, cinematic tone. The target length is substantial, 8,000 to 10,000 characters, requiring extensive detail and flow while remaining focused on the single event, the interrogation. Finally, output must be in a specific JSON format. Plan 1. Establish setting, the relative safety of the tent after capture, contrasting with the chaos outside. 2. Introduce conflict, the authorities' objective, information/understanding, versus the prisoner's state delirium. 3. Develop interrogation, detail the attempts to guide him, religious questions, logical questioning. 4. Focus on content, describe his answers, not coherent memories, but terrifyingly specific dream fragments mixing faith and violence/ritual. 5. Escalate tension, the authorities realize they are dealing with something psychological or supernatural beyond mere exhaustion. 6. Conclusion, the reveal. The nature of the dreamer's testimony. It points to a shared, profound delusion that has consequences for the entire camp structure. 7. Tone check. Maintain dark, serious, and highly descriptive prose suitable for a professional voiceover. 8. Length management. To reach the required character count while maintaining focus, I must elaborate deeply on the internal emotional states of the characters, the sensory details, the tent, the murmurs, and the complex interaction between dogma and delirium during the questioning. Days bled into nights, the veneer of piety worn thin by sheer exhaustion. The cumulative trauma of relentless marching, scarce rations, and perpetual tension had stripped away the protective layers of discipline, leaving behind a fragile, volatile core of belief. After witnessing the bizarre processions and hearing the fragmented fever dreams from the captured soldier, the camp's command understood that the danger was not external. It was burning out of their own ranks. The focus narrowed to one recurring pattern, an almost magnetic pull toward specific ritualistic sites, always requiring a culmination point, a focal altar for their shared delusion. This led inevitably back to the central well, the source of life, and thus, by extension, their perceived sacred ground. As night descended again, drawing the weary men into a deeper state of trance, the signs became undeniable. Small groups, detached from the main perimeter, began drifting toward the water source. Their movements were synchronized, almost choreographed, a slow, unsettling parade of exhaustion and spiritual mania. They carried objects no one understood, smoothed stones, bits of foreign fabric, shards that reflected no earthly value. These items weren't dropped, they were placed with a meticulous, desperate care, arranged in patterns that defied the logic of military encampment or survival. The medic noted this placement, realizing it spoke less to accidental discarding and more to deliberate, ritualistic, architectural intent. This strange activity was occurring deep within the shadows cast by the palisades, away from the watchtowers, making it difficult for even the most vigilant guards to fully track its progression. It wasn't a raucous brawling. It was worse. It was a murmuring inevitability, a shared psychic tide pulling them toward a single point of convergence. The well itself. The air grew thick with unspoken belief and fatigue. Hours passed in this increasingly charged silence. Then, as the deep blue hours before dawn began to give way to an unnatural pearl gray pallor, the focus intensified. A gathering formed, clustering around the ancient stonework that defined the wellhead. It was not a spontaneous assembly. It possessed the eerie order of ritual. The participants were men who looked physically present, but spiritually absent. Their eyes held a glazed look, distant, as if observing a reality only they could perceive. They began to gather in concentric circles, forming a perimeter around the silent sentinel of stone and bucket. What followed was deeply disturbing because it felt so orderly. They started chanting, but these were not the powerful anthems of holy war. Instead, the sounds emerged as a low, rhythmic hum, a combination of archaic Latin phrases mixed with unintelligible gibberish that seemed to vibrate against the very bones of the camp. It lacked the sharp conviction of prayer. Instead, it carried the dulled resonance of performance. The central well became their altar, transformed in their minds from mere functional infrastructure into a sacred portal, or perhaps even an aperture through which their destined crusade must pass. This ritual was fueled by profound, sleep-deprived delusion, a manifestation of collective trauma given religious meaning. The chanting increased in intensity, though never reaching a pitch that suggested fervor. It felt measured, mechanical, like the grinding turning of massive gears deep beneath the earth. They began to sway together, their movements mirroring each other with unsettling precision. It was synchronized ritual action, transforming the men into an almost singular entity, driven by shared subconscious need. As this gathering neared its zenith, as the light outside shifted from night to that terrifying liminal space just before sunrise, a desperate authority finally intervened. The senior commander, watching the proceedings unfold from the reinforced safety of the main keep, realized they were witnessing not merely delirium, but a potential breach of internal control, a threat born of their own misguided piety. He roared the order for intervention. Knights and hardened guards, adrenaline finally overcoming fatigue, moved as one, forming lines designed to physically separate the afflicted men from the sanctity of the wellhead. The sudden imposition of physical reality against the backdrop of their spiritual mania was explosive. Resistance did not come in the form of armed combat. It manifested as a wave of profound, desperate inertia, a resistance to separation. When the guards made contact, pushing and pulling, trying to break the circle, the men reacted with an unnatural strength, fueled by ritualistic fervor. They stumbled backward, clinging to the well's stone lip as if it were the last remaining piece of solid ground in a sea of madness. The brief, violent skirmish drained every last reserve of remaining physical energy. It was too much for all involved. The sustained tension, combined with the metabolic cost of constant hyperalertness, finally proved too great an expenditure for the collective body. As the true dawn began to streak across the eastern sky, bathing the scene in clear, unavoidable light, the ritualistic performance faltered immediately. The chanting stumbled into disjointed murmurs and then fell silent. The synchronized swaying ceased abruptly mid-measure. The men simply dropped. They did not collapse in dramatic failure. They slumped, heaps of exhausted flesh, some vomiting bile from their stomachs, others weeping silently from the sheer effort of maintaining a hallucination, but most simply collapsing into an immediate, profound, unconscious slumber. In the sudden, dreadful silence that followed this mass physical shutdown, the initial signs of madness were momentarily muted, replaced by a heavy, oppressive stillness. And on the ground beneath them, amidst the scattered refuse and discarded elements of their nocturnal rites, the stones, the pieces of cloth, the unrecognizable fragments, a pattern remained. It was not random detritus. It was an arrangement formed with profound care and unnatural geometry that spoke a clear, dreadful message to those awake. A map pointing directly toward a critical structural weakness in the very lines of defense they had prided themselves on maintaining. The nightmare, for all its terror, had delivered the blueprint for their own salvation, or perhaps their final fall. The air had become thick with pre-dawn tension, a palpable dread mingling with the smell of stale sweat and fear. Every instinct within the camp's leadership screamed that something far more sinister than mere exhaustion was at play. The previous night's collapse, the revelation etched into the ground by discarded fragments, had shaken them to their core. They knew they were compromised, exposed not just to an enemy outside the palisade, but to a fundamental breakdown of their own collective sanity. They watched the gathering near the central well with horrified anticipation. The commanders realized that if this ritualistic fervor reached its peak unchecked, it wouldn't merely be another night's skirmish. It would be an undoing, a catastrophic sundering of their purpose and discipline. There could be no waiting for natural collapse this time. The intervention had to be swift, decisive, and brutally effective. The order was given: separation. Knights and guards were immediately deployed in flanking lines, forming human barriers designed to physically divide the core group from the central well. These men, the afflicted Crusaders, seemed almost oblivious to the danger they presented to themselves, their focus solely locked on the alleged power radiating from the water source. They chanted in low, rhythmic tones, a slurry of broken Latin and incomprehensible cries, their synchronized movements suggesting not devotion, but an automaton response. Each passing minute felt like hours, stretching out the agonizing tension until it threatened to snap the will of every man present. The frontline guards moved with practiced precision, pushing back against the encroaching tide of delirium. But the resistance was unexpected. It wasn't the wild frenzy they had anticipated. Instead, there was a strange inertia, a stubborn refusal to be separated from the right. When men were physically intercepted, the reaction was not panic, but a localized surge of defensive confusion. They would flail weakly, mouths still chanting their disjointed liturgical phrases, their movements suggesting less defiance and more mechanical difficulty in processing command. The attempt at forceful separation created a ripple effect throughout the camp's periphery, the structure holding the men together, a delicate blend of shared psychosis and profound fatigue, began to strain. Some core members paused their chants, turning briefly with blank stares toward the advancing guards, as if attempting to reconcile the foreign reality of restraint with the sacred narrative they had constructed in their sleep. These brief moments of vacant awareness were more unsettling than open aggression. The struggle drained reserves that were already running perilously low. The physical exertion required to maintain these lines was exhausting not just the muscles, but the collective nervous energy of the leadership. Every shout, every shove, echoed with an alarming lack of sustainable force. It was a battle against delusion itself. You could subdue the bodies, but you couldn't quiet the deep-seated psychological current driving the ritual. As dawn approached its inevitable crest, the tactical intervention continued to push the limits. The guards formed tighter shields around the perimeter, forcing the afflicted men back toward the well's central circle. The energy of their resistance seemed fueled by belief itself, a purely mental force that defied physical law and exhaustion. It was a desperate spectacle, disciplined military formations clashing with ecstatic, gibbering abandon. The climax approached not with a battle cry, but with an absolute silencing. A subtle shift in the quality of the light outside began to permeate even the thickest fabric of their shared hallucination. The rising sun, undeniable and relentless, started to pierce through the smoke and the terror-induced gloom. It was a force that could not be ignored, a reminder of objective reality. The resistance faltered. The intensity in the men's eyes seemed to dim, replaced by a profound vacancy. The synchronized movements slowed, becoming sluggish, weighted down by an unshakable lethargy. The chanting stuttered, losing its rhythmic conviction until it dissolved into weak murmurs, like whispers fading on the morning wind. Then, abruptly, everything stopped. Without warning, without struggle, the highly charged atmosphere of desperate ritual shattered. The men simply fell, not with a dramatic crash, but with the quiet, heavy slump of weights suddenly released from an overhead mechanism. They collapsed in slow heaps around the well's stone basin. Some lay weeping, their grief unattached to any visible trauma. Others vomited onto the dusty earth, their physical systems rejecting the night's excesses. Most simply drifted into a deep, unconscious slumber, utterly undone by the combination of warfare, ritualistic delirium, and sheer biological collapse. The immediate aftermath was one of profound silence, broken only by labored breathing and occasional riches. The command structure remained standing, bodies aching, adrenaline finally ebbing away to leave behind brittle exhaustion. They stood over the fallen men, recognizing their victory not as a military conquest, but as a desperate reprieve from self-destruction. The initial focus of the leaders shifted immediately, their minds racing past the unconscious forms. The strange pattern on the ground, illuminated now by the clearer light of true dawn, remained. It was still there, precisely mapped with ritualistic objects, broken idol fragments, carefully placed scraps of colored cloth, unidentifiable bones, the accidental architecture of a nightmare. The significance of these placements became starkly clear under the harsh reality of the morning sun. They were not random detritus, they were directional markers. The pattern formed an indisputable, chilling blueprint. It didn't point toward a general vulnerability in their defenses against an outer foe. Instead, it highlighted a critical, overlooked weak point directly within their own defensive line, a segment of the palisade that had been deemed impregnable by pride and routine. This evidence demanded not just attention, but immediate, radical reconsideration of every assumption they had held about their safety and survival. The dawn arrived not with the promise of light, but with a profound, unsettling stillness. For days, the encampment had existed in a fog of relentless exhaustion and escalating dread. The ritual at the well, though violently curtailed hours before, left the air charged with a peculiar, disturbed silence. The Crusaders, having fought both external threats and their own disintegrating minds, now stood broken on the sodden earth. The synchronized movements that had characterized the final phases of delirium did not gradually diminish, they simply ceased. It was an instantaneous snap, like a taut rope going slack in the hands of exhausted puppeteers. Where minutes earlier there had been rhythmic chanting, bodies swaying to an internal, maddening beat, now there was only stillness. The men collapsed. They fell away from the well and from each other, sprawling into heaps of weary muscle and spent will. Some were vomiting onto the cold ground, retching up the visceral remnants of sleepless nights and fear. Others wept silent tears carving paths through the grime, and sweat on their faces, but most simply surrendered, sinking into a deep, profound, unconscious slumber, the kind of rest that goes beyond mere sleep, suggesting total mental withdrawal. It was an emptying out, a dramatic deflation of all unsustainable tension. The delirium had achieved its goal. It had burned away the excess energy and revealed the underlying structure of their breakdown. They were temporarily incapacitated, vulnerable to anything but exhaustion itself. The commanding officers watched this spectacle from a distance, rigid with shock, their initial strategies utterly nullified by biological collapse. Every plan, every tactical maneuver they had devised through force and argument had hit an insurmountable barrier. Fatigue, the sheer physical toll of fighting both armies and mania, had reached its critical mass. They remained standing figures among the unconscious tide, unable to move toward their fallen brethren. The silence that descended was far heavier than any cacophony. It was the vacuum where sanity used to reside. In this quiet aftermath, what became visible took on a disturbingly sharp focus. The debris of the ritual, the strange objects, had not been scattered randomly across the trampled ground. They were piled, arranged, and placed with deliberate care around the immediate vicinity of the wellhead. Broken idols, shards of ceramic painted with unrecognizable symbols, strips of dyed cloth that bore no heraldry, bones cleaned almost meticulously, and peculiar arrangements of stones, all of them forming a pattern too distinct to be accidental. The medic, kneeling gingerly amidst the unconscious men, recognized it immediately. This was not mere refuse. It was an instruction manual written in debris. The patterns formed lines, connecting specific focal points on the periphery of the camp. When viewed holistically, the placement revealed a precise geometric layout that correlated exactly with the vulnerable sections of their own defensive perimeter. They had inadvertently drawn a map. The knowledge struck the senior commanders with the force of physical blow. The men hadn't just been participating in a random frenzy. Their sleepwalking, manic rituals had culminated in a highly coordinated act of intelligence gathering. They had marked their own vulnerability for an unseen observer. The realization was terrifying, shifting the blame and focus entirely away from mere psychological breakdown and toward catastrophic operational failure. The whispers at the breach were no longer merely symptoms of delirium. They were cryptic warnings disguised as sacred rite. The pattern indicated the overlooked weaknesses, a section of palisade too far withdrawn, a stretch of earth unguarded by natural cover, an egress point that was critically exposed despite their vigilant preparations. It was a vulnerability visible only to eyes unburdened by the constant stress of command and combat. The remaining standing men exchanged looks that held not exhaustion, but stark terror. They were suddenly faced with with a horrifying truth. If this delirium was merely psychological, then the ritual objects would be irrelevant. But because the pattern pointed so clearly, so clinically toward their flanks, they knew it was something else entirely, a kind of prophetic, deeply embedded message. The collapse had provided not respite, but a dreadful, immediate strategic gift. Their next actions could no longer wait for them to regain consciousness. Survival now demanded an instantaneous, radical pivot based on the blasphemous map left by men who barely understood what they were doing. The great silence that followed was heavier than any shout, denser than the deepest night fog. It pressed down on everything, demanding absolute focus from men who had seen their command structure buckle under a strain they never imagined possible. The remnants of holy fervor, the echoes of arcane chanting, and the raw exhaustion of physical collapse evaporated instantly, leaving behind only damp earth and discarded detritus. For the command staff, the immediate horror of the scene was replaced by a sudden, paralyzing dread. What did this unnatural slumber mean? Their men lay scattered across the ground, casualties not of enemy arrows or blade strikes, but of their own minds. Amidst the heap of unconscious bodies and the residual tension in the air, the medics began their slow, systematic survey. It was a painstaking task, moving from one slumped figure to the next, cataloging both the physical injuries and the profound psychological trauma etched onto every face. As they cleared away the signs of sickness and fatigue, something else caught the eye, the debris itself. What had been an accumulation of broken idols, pieces of stained silk, smooth river stones, and oddly shaped wooden scraps, during a state of feverish delirium, suddenly began to reveal an unnerving logic. It was not random scattering, it was architecture. The scattered fragments formed patterns that commanded attention, lines connecting distinct markers placed with deliberate, almost mathematical precision across the open ground near the central well. The initial assumption was simply ritualistic waste, the refuse of a deranged communion. But as the senior tactical officers began to walk the perimeter established by these objects, the confusion began to give way to acute alarm. These lines were not merely decorative, they demarcated boundaries. They spoke of an intended structure that went far beyond mere symbolic worship. The pattern was too precise, too regular to be a fluke born of mass exhaustion. Instead, it suggested a blueprint, a diagram laid out in earth and object. The medic kneeling among the debris traced the connections with trembling fingers, realizing with growing horror what the meticulous placement represented. It charted not a spiritual circuit, but a topographical one. The structure formed an intricate, undeniable map. It bypassed obvious patrol points, running instead along shallow ravines and natural dips in the terrain that had always been overlooked by the High Command's usual military focus. The lines pointed directly at gaps in the earthworks, sections where the palisade appeared structurally sound from a distance, but which were vulnerable to targeted attack or lateral breach. It was an exposed artery right under their noses. Discovery struck the senior commanders like a physical blow. Their entire defensive posture, built upon years of assumption and military arrogance, suddenly felt flimsy, provisional. They had been meticulously observed, not by human scouts, but by a deeply collective, primal subconscious that managed to articulate their weakest points, using nothing but stones and scraps. The gravity of the situation forced an immediate pivot from analyzing psychosis to tactical survival. The mystery was no longer solely one of failed piety. It was about imminent danger. If these objects were indeed pointing toward the true gaps in their defenses, then the battle they feared was not merely a spiritual conflict. It was a siege played out on terms dictated by delirium. The initial plan, fueled by defensive routine and faith, required constant manning of easily visible points. But the map whispered of flanking maneuvers, of weaknesses that would only be exploited when morale flagged or attention drifted. It suggested that the enemy did not need to batter down their gates. They simply needed to find the seams. The exhaustion that had brought them to this terrifying slumber now provided a chilling clarity. The afflicted state was itself a kind of reconnaissance, a bizarre, brutal intelligence, gathering mechanism powered by shared trauma and deep, unconscious knowledge. It forced the leadership to confront not only the nature of their enemies outside the walls, but the fragility and deep-seated failings within their own rigid, self-imposed order. The immediate next steps were dictated by this terrifying revelation. The commander gathered the remaining officers, pointing down at the earth map with a hand that trembled slightly from the preceding violence. There was no time for philosophical debate about madness. Only the grim necessity of action remained. They had to incorporate these ethereal dictates of dream and fatigue into their waking strategy, or face an inevitable, catastrophic collapse when dawn's deceptive calm broke. The investigation into the nature of the delirium continued in parallel. While the engineers raced to reinforce the identified breach points, medical personnel cautiously studied the objects themselves. Were they purely symbolic, or did they hold some physical function, a binding agent, perhaps, or a marker that influenced the flow of earth and energy in unusual ways? The true source of this uncanny foresight remained hidden, wrapped within the deep, shared exhaustion that had brought these men to their temporary, yet profoundly informative, oblivion. The dawn offered respite only until the next great mystery forced them to confront not just fear, but the deepest vulnerabilities